Welcome to another Vinimark podcast, where we engage in conversations along the rough edges of wine commerce, science, and cellar mastery amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers. Now, today we're homing in on the role that yeast plays in the development of wine flavor. Now, for the most part, the role of yeast gets overlooked by the casual wine drinker because spending time pondering these invisible microorganisms is a far less romantic endeavor than waxing lyrical about the galets of southern Rhone or the terroir of sun-kissed vines in Tuscany. But the fact remains that these shy little dark-dwelling fungi are responsible for the production of many of the most exciting flavors and aromas that give wine all its romance in the first place. So today we're going to touch on a few interesting developments in the world of wine yeast to try and help us better understand why some wines taste the way they do. And to help us along, we're chatting to Dr. Carien Coetzee, the founder of Basic Wine. Carien is also an international wine judge for the Concours Mondial du Sauvignon and a doctor of Agricultural Oenology. She also has a special interest in the effects of winemaking practices on Sauvignon Blanc. So first of all, Carien, thank you so much for being willing to give of your time today, especially straight after having to drink Sauvignon Blanc from around the world for 2 days non-stop. We know how taxing that can be.
Thanks, John. I know it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
I wanted to start off by clearing up some basic terminology that often gets thrown onto wine labels, and yet these terms can mean very little to the consumers that are actually reading those labels. So one of the terms that keeps popping up is natural yeasts. Can you tell me what this term implies?
So, natural yeasts, they are yeasts that are naturally present in the vineyard and on the grapes, and it's present at the time of harvest. So, what happens is they are harvested with the grapes and processed in the cellar with the grapes and into the juice, and then they can initiate fermentation. The alternative to natural yeast, or the opposite of natural yeast, would be kind of the commercial yeasts that are propagated and freeze dried that you can purchase from a yeast supplier and then is used to inoculate the juice and to then induce fermentation. Now, there are certain very important pros and cons to both of these types of yeast, such as the fact that natural yeasts tend to be alcohol intolerant. They can't handle alcohol, so they struggle to finish the fermentation. And also, another thing that can be quite problematic is that natural yeast might contribute an unpleasant aroma profile. You don't really know what those yeasts are, you can't identify them.
So when people talk about Saccharomyces cerevisiae as a strain, is that a natural yeast or is that something from a lab?
Both. So it can be naturally present in the vineyard on the grapes, and especially I want to say in the cellar. The Saccharomyces cerevisiae is usually present all over in the cellar, so that can also induce fermentation. But Saccharomyces cerevisiae, because of its alcohol tolerance, it is a very fitted yeast to do wine fermentation because it can finish the fermentation successfully and thereby convert all of the sugars to alcohol. So that is why Saccharomyces cerevisiae is often selected to propagate and to make a commercial yeast that you can buy, just because it usually equates to a successful fermentation and it has predictable aroma attributes that it can contribute.
Okay, so I suppose the irony in the life of a yeast strain is that you produce alcohol as a result of your metabolism, but that alcohol ultimately kills you, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And Saccharomyces cerevisiae just takes longer to die, and so it can ferment more completely.
Exactly.
So then there's one more term I wanted to clear up. Rather than talk about natural yeast, I wanted to ask a little bit about neutral yeasts, because in my mind, and I think in the mind of many wine lovers, yeast just converts sugar to alcohol. So why does it need to be neutral or not neutral?
A neutral yeast will probably be defined as a yeast that does not specifically modify the juice in an expressive way, meaning that the wine that is resulting from the fermentation using a neutral yeast might not have high intensities of specific aromatic attributes. It might not be very expressive. The wine might be a bit lower in aromatic intensity, and therefore, yeah, it might not change too much, or liberate a lot of the aromatic potential that is in the juice.
Okay, well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense in the context of what we've been reading often about these so-called thiol-boosting yeasts, which I imagine are not neutral. And I know there are these established products like Vin 7, which seems to have taken the world by storm, or at least the world of Sauvignon Blanc by storm, because it seems to be able to modulate these resultant aromas in wines like Sauvignon Blanc. Can you tell us a little bit more about how these work?
So I actually published a summary of how this works in the Wine Technical in August in 2020, and it's an article called Yeast and its Ability to Release Thiols. And it's super interesting because yeast differ significantly, and exactly like you also said, you can have the neutral yeast that would not necessarily have the potential to release and to form things like thiols, which is very potent aromatic compounds. But the thing is, the exact mechanisms for how this release and formation of odoriferous or aromatic thiols are still not entirely clear. But it is definitely clear that yeast strains differ significantly in their ability to do this. The ability or the lack thereof can be exploited by the winemaker to specifically craft the desired wine style by selecting the specific yeast strain with specific properties and capabilities. In general, it's all got to do with the genetic makeup of the yeast, things like the yeast's ability to transport some of these precursors into the cell, the ability of the yeast to then transform the precursor, and then the formation of specific enzymes to cleave the precursors and to release the aromatic compound. Certain yeasts have the ability to do all these different steps, and this is mainly due to the fact that they have a specific gene, the IRC7 gene, that allows them to successfully convert the precursor into the aromatic compound. Not all yeast strains have this IRC7 gene, and their ability to release thiols is then prohibited.
Okay, so am I understanding it correctly? Grape juice has a whole bunch of building blocks that will eventually become amazing aromas. And some yeasts are just better at taking those building blocks and turning them into these amazing aromas, which in this case, we're talking about thiols. Is that correct? So thiols don't actually exist without the yeast doing its thing.
Yes, in broader terms, you are correct. There might be other ways of releasing mechanisms, but it's very small concentrations that will contribute. So, yes, I would say yeast would be 95% responsible for the formation of thiols from building blocks already existing within the juice. That's always for me interesting. If you do trials with the same juice in different yeast strains, let's say a neutral yeast strain and a thiol expressive yeast strain, you will get amazing differences in results. And always remember that the wine made with a neutral yeast strain, it is actually still sitting on a major potential. The potential just never was released.
So you do need the raw ingredients first, and I guess that is why winemakers and vignerons and viticulturists still highlight the importance of terroir, because you can't take poorly grown grapes, throw them into a fermentation vat, and then add a magic yeast to produce great wine.
Absolutely.
But and we have been talking about a yeast strain specifically, but it's not just the yeast strains that affect the result, right? It's what you feed the yeast as well. Is that correct?
Yes, the yeast needs to be supported in terms of healthy growing and propagating and then transforming the aromas.
I think many of us wine lovers simply think that if the yeast has sugar, then it's happy. But obviously, there are these other elements. So, at a basic level, are you able to tell us what are the sort of core ingredients that the yeast needs to really live the good life in a fermentation vessel?
Well, yeast needs quite a bit, but things like nitrogen containing compounds, sulfur containing compounds, and vitamins and minerals, these are all types of things that the yeast will need to be able to thrive.
Carien, I remember in 2020 I was reading some of the material that you'd written for the Sauvignon Blanc Association of South Africa, and I remember you talking about the product called Inartis Nutrifirm X, which is exactly the sort of nutrient supplement that we've just been talking about, and it seems to be able to boost thiols by sometimes as much as 500%, which to me seems quite significant. Now, you were on the blind panel that was used to taste some of the wines that were produced using that product. Can you tell me about your experience of drinking the wines in that trial?
Yeah, sure. The wines made from supplementing the fermentation with Nutrifilm X were a stark contrast to the control wines, which were fermented by not using Nutrifilm X. The wines were extremely expressive, a lot of thiol-related attributes such as passion fruit, grapefruit, guava, tomato leaf, It's very expressive wine. So it seems that this compound is really helping the yeast to unlock the potential that is in the juice. The wines are, like I said, aromatically very expressive wines. In some cases, it was less expressive. The intensity of expressiveness would absolutely differ in terms, especially in terms of the yeast strain that was used and also the different types of juices that was used. But I think for me, the main take home message from that day was not only the aromatic expressiveness, which I actually expected to a certain extent, but the incredible contribution to the mouthfeel of the wine. It just added this type of roundness and fullness to the palate, which was very, very pleasing and a pleasing attribute.
Fascinating. So when you talk about super expressive, are there particular flavor notes that show up more frequently than others in Sauvignon Blanc?
It is very much down the line of Thiols in terms of passion fruit, guava, and then especially the tomato leaf, which is, it's almost like a green thiol that comes up, and it especially manifests in wines where the thiols are in elevated concentration, so higher than a normal high thiol wine. The aromatic contribution of thiols can change as the concentration changes within a wine. So let's say at a moderate concentration, you might get some grapefruit or citrus. And then as the concentration increases, it changes into guava and passion fruit. And as it increases even further, it can change into tomato leaf and even that cat urine. So there was definitely, you could see this spectrum of thiol related attributes manifesting in the wines.
We have been talking about thiols quite a lot, and I know that you've done a lot of work in this area in Sauvignon Blanc, and you've also done a lot of work on the effects of aging on these groups. So how do the wines with these very expressive boosted thiol levels stand up to aging? Because I know that's Sauvignon Blanc is often criticized for not being able to age, and then there's a whole nother school of thought that says no, it actually gets amazing. But what happens to these super expressive tropical aromas as these wines age?
That is a very interesting question, and it is a question that we get a lot from the industry. So it is definitely something that you need to consider. But let me start off by explaining that thiols in general, they are unstable, especially the varietal fruity volatile thiols, and they are sensitive to oxidation. So you will see a decrease in the concentration over time, but this is irrespective of the concentration present. If you have a lot of thiols or whether you have relatively little thiols, you will see a decrease over time. I'm now a little bit generalizing, but the thiols that are formed from the fermentation with Nutrifilm X, they do not differ in chemical composition from the thiols that are formed without the Nutrifilm X. The only thing that the Nutrifilm X is doing is that it is allowing the yeast to unlock more of the potential and is allowing the yeast to make more of the thiol. We have seen that, if you have sufficient SO2 and low storage temperature, that it is very efficient at preserving the thiols and thereby extending the half-life of the compound. So it will, preserve the concentration for a longer time. If it is not stored properly, we see quite a fast decrease in some of the important thiols. But now what happens is the major difference comes, and especially with a product with Nutrifilm X, is that your starting concentration is much higher. So you now have a wine with much higher thiol concentrations than a wine made without Nutrifilm X. Now, after a while of storage, let's say it was incorrect storage conditions, you're seeing a decrease in your fruity volatile thiol concentration. And what is happening now is because you had this intense thiol wine, you are now seeing a decrease in thiols. You are much faster noticing the difference in the aromatic composition or the intensity of the wine's aromatic because you started at a high concentration. If you work with a wine with, let's say, much lower thiols, again, you will also see a decrease in thiols over time. But when it comes to the sensorial evaluation, you won't necessarily notice such a huge difference because you started already at a low concentration. So actually the Nutrifilm X wines, or any wine for a matter of fact, it doesn't have to be Nutrifilm X, any wine that started with a high thiol concentration, they are more subject to, changing over time just because the starting wine was so intense. So in all cases, whether you have a lot of thiols or if you don't have a lot of thiols, you need to have you need to make sure that your wine has a strong enough backbone to support the wine, even if the thiols are no longer present or prominent. But this is relevant, again, for all types of aroma compounds, and it's not only relevant to thiols. If you had a very expressive Riesling and you see a decrease in your terpenes, you need to make sure that, whatever is in the wine together with those very expressive compounds, it needs to be there to support your, let's say, your prominent compound, but also to support the wine and to carry the wine if those compounds are not there anymore.
Okay, so that makes total sense, because a lot of the critiques of these sorts of wines made by winemakers who perhaps insist on a more natural winemaking ethos say, "Oh, these wines age terribly." But at a kind of chemical level, the fact is that they don't age worse. It's simply that the change is more noticeable because the thiol component plays a greater role. But actually, the backbone of each wine might be very similar and will age in a very similar fashion. Is that true?
Yes, I think that is a very good summary. And just maybe one more thing to mention there would be that, remember, if let's say you have the same juice, let's just use the example of Nutrifilm X, one with Nutrifilm X, one without. Your starting wine will probably have different concentrations of thiols. Now, your low thiol wine will, after let's say 6 months, have lower thiols, and you probably won't see much of a difference in terms of aging, while your high thiol wine will probably still have more thiols left than the control wine. So after the same amount of aging, even though you do see a much bigger difference from the starting wine, you will probably still end up in a better position than when compared to the control.
Most of the conversations that we've been having around super yeasts and yeast nutrients have played out in the sort of Sauvignon Blanc field. And I mean, I'd go so far as to say that yeast strains like Vin 7 and Vin 13 and even have a sense of celebrity about them. And I was with some winemakers the other day, and one of them said, "Oh, I can smell Vin 7 when I walk into a winery." And I thought that was quite an interesting comment. I wondered if there were similar sorts of yeast strains that pop up in red wine cultivars, or are the effects of yeast in red wine a little more subtle?
I do think that the effects of yeast on red wine is more subtle. And I think the main reason for this would be because of the extraction of so many compounds from the skins and phenolic compounds and all types of different precursors, which is obviously not done when you make general white wine. So red wines have many other aromatic and non-aromatic compounds that can affect the perception of the yeast-derived aromas. So even if the yeast is producing the same amount of, let's say, thiols, even if the yeast is producing the same amount of thiols in the red wine as it would in a white wine, the sensory perception will likely be much less intense due to sensory interactive effects such as enhancing effects or suppressing effects. And there are studies that also show that, even non-aromatic compounds such as phenolics can have suppressing effects on other aroma compounds. So I almost want to say there's just a lot more going on in a red wine, and many more compounds that you need to consider that can affect the perception of aroma compounds. So, but in a chemical terms, in most cases, the yeast is probably producing the same amount of aroma compounds. It's just that you can't really perceive it the same way.
Because there's so much more going on around it, I guess.
Yes.
You said something earlier which I found quite interesting, and that was that it wasn't just the aromas of a wine that were modulated by the presence of a specialized yeast nutrient or yeast, but also the mouthfeel. Can you tell me a little more about some of the compounds that perhaps contribute to an increased mouthfeel?
So the yeast contributes quite significantly, and I think the main compound that is contributing to the mouthfeel would be ethanol. So ethanol, as we all know, you can very quickly distinguish when a wine has very low ethanol concentration. Ethanol really gives you also a fuller mouthfeel and gives fullness to a wine. But it's not only ethanol. Many other compounds can also be either produced by the yeast or it is extracted from the yeast cell. And we've seen there are quite a few studies showing this, that autolytic degradation of dead yeast cells after they fermented and they've died, then some of the compounds are extracted from the cell walls and even from the inside of the cell. And this process we call autolysis. And some of these compounds can then also contribute to the mouthfeel and the fullness of a wine.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense because there is that Chardonnay yeast CY3709, I think it is, that claims to trigger autolysis more quickly. So, can you tell me a little bit about how that would affect the mouthfeel of a wine?
Yeah, so autolysis of yeast during aging on lees is essentially sought because it improves the aromatic balance of a wine, as it favors the release of certain compounds such as lipids, nitrogenous substances, vitamins, polysaccharides, and also some of which can be considered to be precursors of aroma, which may therefore affect the final bouquet of wines aged on lees. It can add to the body and roundness of the bouquet of the wine and potentially also confer better keeping quality. So it might help with antioxidant properties and the aging ability of the wine. So, like I also mentioned, the drawbacks of some of these processes would be that it is slow and it is expensive when you have natural autolysis. So that's why you get yeast like this Chardonnay yeast CY3709 can be quite helpful to speed up the process. And also, you can add exogenous enzymes that can also help with the speeding up of the autolysis.
Okay, so with the production of like heightened levels of thiols, you were talking about how winemakers can overdo it, and there are drawbacks to that. Are there similar sorts of drawbacks in the process of using a yeast that might trigger autolysis more quickly?
I mean, like any other type of least contact, you need to be careful that because the yeast lease has quite a strong reductive power. So you need to think twice when you're aging on lease, whether it is a accelerated autolysis or not, to make sure that there are no appearance of unpleasant aroma compounds. So these type of smells are sometimes inevitable during the first months of aging on the lees, and as a result the wine must be clarified rapidly to prevent these reduced odors from becoming worse as it is longer on the lees. So definitely just make sure that you keep an eye out for, I almost want to say, the normal risks which is associated with extended lease contact.
So I suppose it's a similar case with yeast and with autolysis in that earlier we were talking about how thiols can't be produced unless the base building blocks are there. And I suppose in the same way, the effects of autolysis aren't going to be different in the presence of this CY3709. They're just going to happen more quickly. So a winemaker just needs to be aware that the entire process happens faster.
I'm not entirely sure whether this is completely like that. But what you're saying is true, but I do think that there might be other factors. I'm not sure whether certain yeast lees or from certain strains might have, more potential to turn reductively faster. I certainly haven't really heard too much of a rumble, in the industry about that, but I do think that it is possible. If you think of something like H2S formation, which is a sulfur compound, if the yeast is prone to produce more sulfur containing amino acids or breaking down more sulfur containing amino acids, I would presume that it will most likely also be prone to release more of these compounds during aging on the lees. But this is a bit of speculation. I'm not entirely sure how scientifically sound it is.
Oh, well, it looks like I'm going to have to go and do some homework to try and find out what's out there. You spoke about rumblings in the industry, and I wanted to finish off our chat today to talk about some of the things or some of the scientific advances that are happening at the moment. I mean, up to now, we've been talking about things that are out there that winemakers are using that are affecting the wines that we're drinking. But I'd love to know, are you aware of some exciting advances that are kind of coming into the industry now that we will start to see in the coming months or in the coming years in winemaking in South Africa?
Think one of the most exciting things that I've seen recently would be, especially in terms of yeast strain, would be the occurrence or the use of yeast strain Lisantia thermotolerans. It is a yeast strain that has been kind of investigated now for a few years, and there's quite a lot of really interesting scientific publications out there. Well, this yeast strain is an acidifying, low ethanol yielding yeast, and it is especially useful when you are sitting with a situation where you have high sugar musts and low acidity. So, yeah, the yeast is usually naturally found on grapes and in wines, And like I said, it's been investigated for its application in oenology for many years already. So some of the main things that are quite exciting about this yeast would be, the major metabolic contribution of Lisantia thermotolerans is a partial conversion of sugar to lactic acid as opposed to ethanol. So it's kind of changing the direction of the fermentation.
Okay, so hang on. Let me
So
just interrupt you there. Let me interrupt you there. So you're saying there's a yeast strain that can take sugar and instead of turning it into alcohol, can partially turn some of that sugar into an acid. Is that correct?
yes,
That sounds amazing.
yes, I must say, and the results is quite astounding, and it's actually very efficient in converting sugars to lactic acid. Some like the studies have shown that the maximum reported concentration of lactic acid formed using this yeast was 16.6 grams per liter. Now that was just in one study, so that is quite a significant amount of lactic acid. While by comparison, Saccharomyces yeast, they produce very little, if any, lactic acid at all. Now, the advantage of having an increased lactic acid is that it is an effective acidulant. So, like I said earlier, if you have a wine with very low acidity, this yeast can help to elevate the acidity. And it is a stable acid. So it's not like malic acid that can be almost microbially unstable. It is physicochemically and microbially quite stable. Yeah, like I said, while other permitted acidulants might not be.
I mean, to me, this is mind blowing. Especially, South Africa is by and large a warm wine growing region, and the problem that we have is grapes getting too ripe too quickly. So you got too much sugar, not enough acid, and this is like it's a yeast strain that can solve both those problems at the same time, or at least in part. I mean, so surely there must be some dramatic drawback. Are you, are you aware? I mean, if there aren't drawbacks, why is this not better known? Or maybe it's just me who doesn't know about it.
I mean, it is relatively new, this yeast strain, but just to add to what this yeast can actually do is just by diverting the fermentation from ethanol to lactic acid, you're now also reducing your alcohol content, and usually it lowers by about 1%, which can be significant in commercial terms. And then what is also nice, like you said, in this warmer wine growing areas where you struggle with high sugar, low acid, and also perhaps flat and flabby type of wines. A recent study has shown with a Merlot wine that it really added to this red fruit character to the wines using this fermentation, and also compared to the control, it was much less, or it was more acidic and more lively and much less flat and flabby. So it's not only the acidity, the ethanol, but also just the aromatic composition and how it can contribute to that. And then the other thing to remember, like we also spoke earlier about the natural yeasts and the inoculated yeast, this is typically a yeast that can be naturally present on the grapes. So it's not ethanol tolerant. It is quite intolerant, so meaning it will struggle to finish the fermentation. So you need to do a co-fermentation or with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or sequential inoculation where Saccharomyces will then finish the fermentation. But this is it's not necessarily a drawback. It is just something that you need to consider when you're using this yeast, would be to make sure that you finish the fermentation.
Well, I think that's amazing. I mean, I know as wine geeks, often we want to believe in the kind of alchemy and the natural mystery of it all, where we don't have to add anything and actually just nature itself does what it's supposed to do and out comes this epic wine. But at the same time, it's fascinating to see what I guess science has unlocked for us just by focusing on, as you say, what is already there. So this yeast strain was out there existing in nature, and in one sense, all scientists have done, I guess, is isolate it and identify what it can contribute to a wine. I think that's an incredible thing.
Yeah, I agree. And they are basically, like you said, the scientists are taking this natural tool and just amplifying it, which in my opinion is just another toolbox to create a beverage, to create a wine that is appealing to the consumer.
Absolutely. Well, Carien, I've actually taken way more of your time than I said I would, and I'm very sorry for that. But I'm also not sorry because this chat has been absolutely fascinating, and I so appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. So thank you again. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thank you, John. And it's always a pleasure. And I look forward to our next discussion.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vidimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.